And I'm just going to stand over here, otherwise nobody will know it's a bit voice. Hello and welcome to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. My name is Lizzie Meister. I'm the Public Programs Manager here, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you and Alyson and Shaunna here today to discuss their new book and the heirlooms and stories that inspired it. What's going to happen today is we're going to hear about, these two are going to take it away. They're going to tell us about their stories. And following this presentation, there will be light fights, there already are, and you can go downstairs, purchase a book, and get your book signed. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers. So Shaunna J. Edwards has a BA in literature from Harvard College, a JD from NYU School of Law. A former corporate lawyer, she now works in HR and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is a native Louisianan, raised in New Orleans, and currently lives in Harlem with her husband. The Thread Collectors is her first novel, and you can find her on Instagram at Shaunna J. Edwards. And then Alyson Richman is a USA Today and a #1 international best-selling author of several historical novels, including The Velvet Hours, The Garden of Letters, and The Lost Wife, which is currently in development for a major motion picture. Alyson graduated from Wesley College with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. She's an accomplished painter, and her novels combine a deep love of art, historical research, and travel. Alyson's novels have been published in 25 languages and have reached best-selling lists in the United States and abroad. She lives on Long Island with her husband and 2 children, where she's currently working on her next novel. Find her on Instagram at Alyson Richman. So without further ado, let us welcome Shaunna and Alyson to say
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lizzie. And we want to thank the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience for giving us this opportunity. As Lizzie mentioned, I am a proud Louisianian. I was raised here in New Orleans. I'm a proud Isidore Newman grad, and it's great to be here this evening with my co-author, Alyson.
Yes, thank you so much for having us, Lizzie, and coordinating everything on our behalf. I'm particularly thrilled to be speaking here because for me, with all of my books, I try and somehow weave characters that are Jewish to bring them in the forefront and let people know about the Jewish experience through a historical setting. So your museum to go through the gallery today was just fascinating. So I'm so happy to be here.
Absolutely. So I know that some of you have even read our book and some of you are reading The Thread Collectors right now. Before we dive into showing you some of our family heirlooms, for those of you who have not read the book, I just want to give you a brief summary. Don't worry, there are not going to be any spoilers. So in The Thread Collectors, you're going to meet 2 couples. There is a Black couple, a brilliant musician named William and his beloved Stella. And Stella is in servitude. She is covertly making maps from harvested thread to help enslaved men run to join the Union Army. William also decides to run to join the Union Army. On the battlefield, William meets Jacob. Jacob is a German Jewish immigrant. He has signed up to fight for the Union Army. He is also a brilliant musician. And it's the shared love of music between William and Jacob that really cements their friendship and also opens up how these 4 characters will meet. You're like, 4 characters I haven't heard about before. So 4th is Lily. Lily is a fiery, redheaded abolitionist who looks a lot like Alyson, who is living up north in New York, and she's sending letters and quilts down to her husband, Jacob, on the battlefield. And she's also joining a quilting circle to find camaraderie up north as well. And I'm not going to give away how these 4 stories intertwine, but it really is Jacob and William at heart, both of them underrepresented, both of them marginalized in the Union Army, and how they find common kinship that propels the book along. So that is what you can expect when you meet Thread Collectors.
So I have wanted to write a Civil War novel for, I think, at least 15 years. There's always been something in the back of my head that had been told to me by my grandmother about our family tree. According to my grandmother, my I had two great uncles who fought on opposite sides during the Civil War. On my maternal side, the family had emigrated from Germany, first to New York in the late 1830s. There were three brothers that were born. Jacob Kling was born in 1844, Monroe, who was in 1846, and the oldest brother, Abraham, 1840. At some point, Abraham, the oldest brother, decided he wanted to go down south to a place called Satarsha, Mississippi, and start a mercantile store that grew and grew and grew, and then brought his brother Monroe down to Satarsha, Mississippi too. And the two brothers had this, grew into be quite, I don't want to say it, but a very big department store. But Jacob Kling remained in New York. When the Civil War broke out, Jacob Kling enlisted as a musician in the Union Army, but Abraham enlisted in the Confederacy. And according to my grandmother, she said that decision permanently divided the family forever, and it was never repaired. And she used to joke around and say, and I don't even know if that side of the family is Jewish anymore, I think they're Baptist. But I was the only one listening to my grandmother. Like, no one remembered her telling these stories, but it was always in the back of my mind. And I just thought it would be a very interesting relationship to sort of explore in a novel. And then one day in 2017, I'm very bad at that, I saw a documentary on PBS called Death in the Civil War. And it was by Rick Burns. And it highlighted two things that I wasn't aware of. One was that Black soldiers were forced to bury the Civil War dead with their white compatriots. And when these bodies were hastily buried, sometimes could be Black soldiers, could be white soldiers. Sometimes maps were drawn in the hope that after the war, the families of who had lost a fallen soldier could somehow have some knowledge of where the body had been buried. And so Shaunna and I have been friends for so many years, and we always talk about books with each other. And so I said to Shaunna, I have this like rough idea for a book that wouldn't it be interesting if you had an unexpected friendship on the battlefield between a Black soldier and perhaps a white Jewish soldier, and a map is created by the Black soldier of where body might be buried. Again, I'm not giving up any spoilers. And so I said to Shaunna, do you think that might be an interesting idea for a book?
And I said, it's intriguing. And this was years before we started working on the thread collectors. However, from my perspective, anytime you introduce a Black character into a book, I want to know that character's motivation and that character's backstory. And I wanted to know more about this Black soldier other than him being an instrument to bring the two white people together. So I said, what if he gives the map to his beloved and she sews something? She makes something permanent of this map, preserving it. And the reason why this came into my mind is if we go to the first slide, we'll start to tell you about the things that we've grown up with. I am not a quilt maker, but I have been privileged to come from people who make quilts. And on the left, you can see what is the oldest quilt we still have in our possession. And we actually brought it here today. You can come up later on and touch it very gently. My mother's standing there, she'll look at you with eagle eyes, which I believe is made by my great-grandmother. And also on the right, you have a section of a quilt that contains some of my grandmother's church dresses and my great-grandmother's field dresses. She was working a cotton farm in Louisiana. And that actually hangs in my bathroom. You know, I think a lot of us, when we think about getting ready for the day, when we're thinking about putting on our armor and going out into the world, for me, it's grounding to also have something from the women that have come before me. So having grown up with all of these quilts around me, I thought of sewing as a way to preserve something. I thought of that idea of using remnants of things, particularly when you don't have much and you make something that is very important. So that popped into my mind, and what about this idea, like a sewn map? And it also gave us an opportunity to think about maybe William, our main Black character, being in love, right? And I don't think we talk enough about Black love, and certainly we don't talk enough about Black love during times of enslavement. So we had this conversation, but we didn't do anything with it at that point, it took us about until 2020 to actually write the novel. But what I think is interesting about this slide, the two on the sides are artifacts from my family, but Alyson.
So the slide in the center is a gold thimble. It's 14 karat gold thimble that belonged to the sister of my two great uncles, and that was my great grandmother or great grandmother. And I walk by. My mother has a great fund of all these little pretty things from her family. I actually thought that was like something from a dollhouse. I don't even know what I thought it was. I walked by it my entire life and never knew it was a gold thimble until I knew, like I mentioned to my mother that we were writing a book about, where women would be contributing to the war effort with sewing. And she mentioned that this thimble had been handed down in my family. So one of the reasons why I wanted to put this up there is that through the creative process of creating a novel, I started to learn about some of the family artifacts in my own home that I had never realized were there, or what the story, or who they belonged to. And also now the context that she was the sister of these two soldiers.
I also think what's interesting about this juxtaposition, and Alyson and I learned so much from each other while writing this novel, because we have really authentic conversations about our cultural heritage, is the disparity and the things that people keep. Alyson actually mentioned the fact we probably had quilts in my family, but we didn't keep them because they weren't necessarily necessities. Where in my family, not necessarily having much, we kept them because not only were they necessities, they were art. So sometimes what you have around you and what you've chosen to throw away, they equally tell a story. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. We want to talk to you a little bit more about some of the characters in our real lives, I guess our ancestry that inspired the characters in the book. So there are three Black women in the thread collectors. I've told you about Stella, and you should also know Stella is named after my mama Stella, who's right there. She's gonna be. I told you about Stella. Stella also has a half-sister named Amine, which is also a family name, and their mother is named Janie. Janie is a very strong woman, as one would have to be during the Civil War, raising two daughters and trying to put them in the best situation possible. And Janie was actually inspired by one of my female ancestors, my great aunt, Janie Roach. And Janie managed as a Black woman at that time to become financially independent. She became a landowner, and she even became a lender to members of her family. And, it's interesting because Alyson mentioned that our book and the creative process has allowed us to have conversations that we wouldn't otherwise have had. After we completed this book, I'm talking to my mother and I'm like, I wonder what other types of heirlooms and things we have around. Like, I know about the quilt, we'll see other photos. And she says to me very casually, as only a mother can do, well, we've got great Aunt Janie's cooking pot. I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, you walk by it every day in the TV room. It's like on a shelf. This is it right there. It has, in the photo, it has some tools that my grandfather used. And I never knew that this was great Aunt Janie's cooking pot. Now, it's a cast iron pot and it's heavy as heck, but you can see this patina here. That's not the original patina. That patina is because I grew up in New Orleans East. And when Katrina came and we had 12 feet of water, this was underwater. And 6 weeks later, when my parents went back to see what they could salvage, this was one of the things they salvaged. So even though it was just a cooking pot, right? Thinking about my family lineage, my mother knew that it was important to grab that, to preserve that, and not restore it, right? Because that's part of the story too. So for my nieces, we'll see a picture of them later, when we talk now about great Aunt Janie, and it might be their great Aunt Janie, we'll say not only do you know the story of this cooking pot, but then you tell the story of Katrina. And you tell the story of Black people rebuilding in a neighborhood that's been disinvested in. And these objects, they gain meaning over time. So it's interesting how this book is not just been about research into the Civil War history, it's been about research into our family and so on.
So the artifacts that I have on this slide it's a locket of the parents of Jacob and Emma and Abraham and Maria Clay. They're my great grandparents. Frederica on the right was born in 1810 and she died in 1891. And Henry Clay was born in 1806 and he died in 1885. So this is the oldest heirloom in my family's history. I wanted to share this because for me, this locket was what brought me back to the story. You know, we mentioned that I had this idea that I had talked with Shaunna about in 2017, but I didn't feel ready to write the story. I always describe, you know, when I am creating a novel, it usually takes me 3 years to write. I'm usually by myself with a computer. A finished manuscript is about 100,000 words. It's incredibly solitary work. So everything has to sort of be pointing in the direction that this is the project that you need to be working on. There's almost like an air, you know, a feeling in the air that this is what you should be doing with your time. And I didn't feel confident. I don't know. There was something that held me back to sitting and writing in 2017. And I started another book that was published in 2019. And then in 2020, during the throes of the pandemic, when the world was also, you know, really wrestling with racial and social injustice, it was at the forefront. We had all witnessed the brutal murder of George Floyd. I felt this terrible sense of brokenness. And I also felt that I was starting to see these parallels of what happened during the Civil War in our own, you know, present day. And I started to feel like I really want to return to the Civil War to write a book about it. And I went home to my mother and I said, can you show me the locket of, that I knew were the parents of these two Civil War soldiers? And my mom, I never knew where my mom kept it. I had seen it on occasion, but she kept it on her vanity in a jewelry box that had sort of flowers painted on it that had belonged to her mother. And she picked it up and it was closed. It wasn't open. And as she opened it, she made a comment that, you know, her sister had broken the clasp and that, you know, her mother had felt that her sister was never careful with things and that's why she had them in her possession. I got a story with that. And then she opened it up and the photographs are like daguerreotypes. They're on glass. They're beautiful. And as I held it in my hand, I just felt, I know it sounds corny, but I really felt this connection to my history and feeling that it was now time to write this book. But I also had never forgotten the contribution that Shaunna had given to the storyline when I had spoken with her in 2017. And I also knew that when I met Shaunna for the first time, which was over, you know, almost 15 years ago, she told me that she'd always wanted to write a book. So I reached out to her and I said, do you remember that story that I was telling you about with the Civil War, with the brothers and perhaps combining it with the storyline of a map, and you had mentioned that perhaps the map could be then embroidered to preserve it. And she said, of course I remember it. And I said, would you consider writing the book with me? That we could explore the Civil War through two different lenses, one Black and one, you know, white and Jewish. And I'll let you.
I did not say yes right away for a lot of different reasons. Part of it is because I do have a day job and obviously historical fiction takes an incredible amount of research. The research is no problem, having slogged through law school, but devoting that much time, I didn't quite know if I was ready. But the other was much more emotional, and that is as a Black woman, seeing what was happening in the world and seeing how difficult it is to have honest conversations about race, about religion, about intersectionality, about division. I didn't know if I was ready to revisit the most divisive time, perhaps in our nation's history, while living through the most divisive time in my lifetime. And I had to think about that. And I spoke a lot to people that I love and I care about. And it was my husband who really put it into context. And he said, you're talking a lot about what you might have to give in this process, what it might take from you. But I encourage you, I think he actually used the word, I invite you, he does that a lot. I invite you to think about it as a place where you could actually heal. where you might find some purpose in it. And I think that Alyson and I, we refer to this as our legacy project. And it, for me, has been, it was a way for us to get through the pandemic, get through the height of racial injustice, protest and divisiveness. And we don't know what the future is going to bring, but do something together that really felt right and felt purposeful. So for that, I thank you. So maybe we can go to the next slide, please. So all kinds of love play a part in our book. I think one of the things that you told me, and maybe you can share, you were surprised to really think about, was that enslaved people didn't have the legal right to marry. You know, I think we sometimes take for granted what people may learn in history, what they might remember about the impact in particular of slavery on your everyday life. You know, it's not just you're going out to the field to work during the day and then the rest of it, you know, you don't have any bodily autonomy. So it's really important for me and for both of us that Stella and William be in love. But then you also think about love and the importance of it being recognized, of it being formalized, of you having the rights of being with someone and how important that is and what it means when you don't have that recognition. So when we were thinking about what artifacts and heirlooms today to bring, we started thinking about wedding.
Yes, and so I reached out to my aunt to see what she had in the family archives.
Is it the aunt that wrote
Yeah,
the
this is the aunt. So she got papers. So we didn't know. So she said, you know, I have a wedding contract that belonged to Fanny Kling, which was the other sister, from Temple Emmanuel in New York. And that was also something that I had always heard growing up, that my family had been one of the founding members of Temple Emmanuel. And this is a wedding contract from 1860, May 1860 of Fanny Kling. It's signed by Rabbi Adler. I think Rabbi Adler was a very famous Reform rabbi, for those who are scholars of that. And when I got the picture from my aunt, I called Shaunna and I said, when I look at this now, I realized that when my great aunt Fanny got married in May 1860, if you had enslaved relatives, they wouldn't have been able to marry. And it hit me in a way that I would never have made that connection prior to writing this book. And so I say that because this has been such a learning process for me, and it has made me see the layers of history in such a different way, from my own personal history, but then sort of contrasting it with other people's history as well. So when I said that, what did you pull from her?
Well, this photo on the left is a photo of my paternal grandparents' wedding. I don't know if it's the oldest wedding artifact we have. Moms, we may have others, but it's certainly the oldest one that I live with on a daily basis. This sits in my living room up in New York, and I just love the pride in it. It's from the early 1910s. You know, the fact that you see people really striving and moving forward and gaining some rights and being determined to do what they can with them. I think the other interesting thing about this photograph is a theme that runs throughout the thread collectors, and that's the idea of colorism. My father, who is no longer with us, he was far lighter than my beautiful mother, who looks a lot like me. And I've thought a lot about, even within my own immediate family, like many Black people, I have many different shades of folks in my family. And there is a real issue, particularly I think in the South, about how people are treated depending on white adjacency or adjacency to Christianity. Do you look Jewish? Do you look too Black? And how does your life differ? And how do your opportunities differ when you look much more like the standard or the norm or what someone is going to value? So when I look at these people, I love them, but then I also think about how different this photo looks of my mother's parents and how that might have impacted their lives. I also will tell you, the woman in blue, who maybe my mom knows, I don't know who she is. No one that looked that good to be at my wedding. So I also look at this and I'm like, she's not the best friend. No, so if we go to the next slide, please.
So the slide on the right is Monroe Kling's home in Satarsha, Mississippi, that is a historical landmark now. General Grant actually took possession of that house during the Battle of Vicksburg and lived there, and I think some soldiers lived there as well. So it's still standing. There was a newspaper article that we were able to find online from 1890. Just to put it in context, I have not visited this house in person, but supposedly Satarsha is near Yazoo City. So for anyone who has any family or relatives, that's near where it is. And the article from 1890 described how the house was built by borrowed slaves, which is terrible, and that it had a garden, a very lush garden with fruit trees in the back, and pathways that were made from crushed seashells. And so it was very visual to me, and I decided that I wanted to have a scene in that house in the book. I always thought that a Passover scene would be a very interesting backdrop for two brothers who had very different attitudes towards slavery and civil war, and to see that in context of the story of Passover was interesting. So when you do read the book, that's the house, that's the backdrop in which I imagine them creating that scene.
So when thinking about place, on the left-hand side, those are my three nieces, but they are on a sugarcane farm in Jeanneret, Louisiana, that my siblings and I actually own. It's been, I know it's weird, I'm like being sugar. It's been passed down from my father's side, and there are pieces that have been sold away, but we still own 60 acres of a sugarcane farm that was carved out of a plantation. 100. Oh, Mom said it's 100. She's been hiding the other 40. But you know, we go there obviously to check on it from time to time. And while we deliberately did not put any scenes in the thread collectors on plan, well, we have some not on Louisiana plantations, we have some on South Carolina plantations. We really wanted to focus on some joy. When you go to a place like this, and if you've gone to the Whitney plantation or you go to a sugarcane plantation and you walk the rows, you realize the amount of back-breaking labor that it would have taken to keep the farm going and this economy going. And that concept of being a Black Louisianian really, for me, was important to highlight in the book. One thing that we came across in our research, which maybe you guys are familiar with, but I certainly wasn't, I didn't learn it in school, was about the Battle of Port Hudson, which took place just like an hour and a half away from here. Like I'm seeing some people shake their heads, yes, but this wasn't in my history books. Like I don't remember getting into a bus and see the guy I went to school with back there. I don't remember getting into a bus and going to Port Hudson. And what stood out for me in this story was, we're all familiar with the movie Glory and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, where these brave Black soldiers stormed Fort Wagner and lost their lives. And I guess I had thought that maybe that didn't necessarily happen with Southern soldiers, with Black Southern soldiers, but in fact, the Louisiana Native Guards, which was made up of both formerly enslaved men and free Black people, they were the leading charge at the Battle of Port Hudson. But it was really tragic because the Union officers hadn't done the appropriate amount of reconnaissance, and they basically led the Black soldiers into a shooting gallery. The Confederates held the bluffs, and they just shot down on them. Hundreds of Black men died. But even more tragic was the Union officers didn't want to send good soldiers after bad, and their bodies laid there for weeks. The charge was led by Lieutenant General Andre Caillou, who was a free Black Louisianian. And by the time they got his body back and the other soldiers' bodies, and they forced the Black soldiers to bury these bodies, it had been weeks later, they could only identify Lieutenant General Caillou by his signet ring. They brought his body back to New Orleans, and the Black people in the city had, you know, as we do, they had a huge parade and party for it. But when you think about the dangers that if you were enslaved, you had to confront, to run, to fight. And then you think about being there and first being given pickaxes and hoes and shovels and told you have to do more manual labor. Because let's be real, like Black men were labor for the Union Army. They were not soldiers. They weren't paid the same. They weren't given the same opportunities Then when you finally get the chance to fight, to think that even in death, your honor and your bravery will be disrespected, for me, that really hit hard. You know, you think about people keeping an economy going and then not even being respected in death. So we knew that we wanted to put Port Hudson in our books. If you haven't been to Port Hudson, I say jump in a car. It's like a 70-minute drive and you push it. It's a national park. There are amazing park rangers there. You can walk the lands, and I will tell you that it will change you. And if you're a Louisianian, it will really change you to think about this having happened so close and it not being something that we talk about very much. So maybe if we can just go to the next slide, which is the last slide. I think what Alyson and I want to leave you with today is that we really think about this as our legacy project, right? I don't know that we knew where it would lead in terms of building connection between us, sharing our cultural heritage, finding out more about our families and having conversations with our mothers that we probably wouldn't have had. But we invite you to do the same. This piece of art is called Relics, and it's by an African-American artist, Jesse Cook, who unfortunately has passed away. And my mother commissioned this years ago. I walk by this all the time. It's, you know, on the alcove across from the kitchen. And she asked this artist to take pictures and heirlooms that she has of her family and create something new. So the man in the photograph is William Pinckney Sr., who inspired the character of William. He is my mother's grandfather on her father's side. He was a self-taught preacher and also a small schoolhouse teacher. And the snuff bottles are from my grandmother, horrible habit, but fine. She lived until a really long age, so I guess that's fine. But over time, my mother has also added to it. You can't tell, but there's a little door there. And she has put flowers from her children's wedding in it. And so it's become this evolving piece of art and heirlooms. And I think through this process, we've learned that our heirlooms, our everyday heirlooms, have become evolving pieces of art. And I do think that's what we try to do with our
yeah. And I think it's sort of reinforced that history is all around us, our families are all around us. It's just a matter of asking questions, and then what do you do with them? We all have stories in our families that shouldn't be lost. So I encourage everyone to ask questions, and if you have younger generations, to share your stories with them, because we pulled together to create a book with them, and we're happy for that.
Yes. All right. So with that, I mean, if anyone has questions, we're happy to take them.
Does anybody have questions before I ask one? And then I'll open it. Yeah, okay. Yes.
I know the question I want to thank you for is a very contemporary needed book, because the issues and views are universal. They happen in time. Very stressful past 6 years. And it certainly reflected that while thinking of the essence of a historical novel, but it wasn't the fantasy historical novel. It was very believable, very true to things that happened. So I have confidence on researching and the cleverness of putting it all together.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I will ask a question. So I'm thinking about how the stories you shared, a lot of them, especially William's story and Jacob's story in your family's lives, are reported by men. So I want to know more about the two women in your book, Lily and Stella, perhaps who inspired them, how you got their names, because I feel like Jacob and William, we see where their names came from. But I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit more about Stella and Lily.
Well, it's funny you say that, because definitely, the early gestation of this novel, we were focused on the men, because, I did have this story in my family. And as soon as I said, that, he was a musician, Shaunna was like, well, William should be a musician too, especially in having been in New Orleans. There was immediate that focus. But it was our editor, actually, who got the first 40 pages, who had said, I really would like to see also the backstory of the women and bring them in, what they could contribute into the, to the war effort. So that came second. And so we started digging and thinking, and I mean, you should tell the story about, how you in the very beginning started thinking about a quilt.
So I think, as we mentioned, when Alyson started thinking about the Civil War and this map, we're not giving away spoilers once again. I started saying, well, maybe William, our Black soldier, we didn't have him in the movie at the time, could give this map to his beloved, and she can embroider it and she can make it something real. So we knew we would have a Black heroine. I don't think that we knew all of what her story would be. When we started to build out Stella and Lily, we definitely wanted them to be women who wanted to contribute, but might be constrained either because they are enslaved, because they are scared. In Lily's case, because her social class and her gender don't allow her to necessarily be on, you know, making speeches about abolitionism and being a suffragette out in the street. Like, how could they contribute in a way that may seem quiet at first, but really roars to life? And then as far as the women, I mean, I think we pulled from the women that we know. My mother's name is Stella, and she is strong and she is resourceful. And we wanted to bring all of that to bear. I also think, for me, having 3 Black women in a house was really important. Like, thinking about Black motherhood, and when you were trying to raise strong daughters in really terrible times, really terrible limitations, it means that the advice you give is not going to always be from Dr. Spock. It means that, like, your survival is going to take precedence over fairy tales, to use your words. And so we really wanted to highlight that as well.
And then I think another thing that was interesting was, once we knew that we wanted to also weave in the story of the women, I know from writing fiction that it would be very overwhelming to have all the stories right in the front. We already had 2 very intense stories with the soldiers. We were introducing 3 Black female characters. Lily's voice, I knew, had to come in a different way. And so that's where the letter writing comes from, that you hear her voice in the beginning as she's writing letters from the north to Louisiana when Jacob is down south, and she's observing what's happening up north. And another thing that we felt was very important in this book was to highlight the racism in New York. I mean, I feel that the Civil War is oversimplified when it's, at least the way it was taught to me in my classroom. You know, the North was good, the South was bad, the North was fighting for freedom. That wasn't the case. There were, and also, as we highlight in the book, there was terrible racism and anti-Semitism in the Union Army. But when we discovered, you know, an example like the burning of the Black Children's Asylum in New York, which was on 42nd and 5th Avenue, it was this beautiful structure that had been funded philanthropically. There was a school, a nursery, a small little farm in the back, and 233 Black children were there at the time of the draft riots of July 1863. And a mob of white men surrounded this orphanage and tried to burn all 233 children inside to their death in New York. So, I mean, when I read that, I called Shaunna up and I said, I'm reading a book now that was published by the New York Historical Society, where the only thing that remains from that orphanage is a charred Bible that a Black child carried out miraculously because she knew it was something that was important. And now it's on display at the New York Historical Society. And I said, Shaunna, I never heard of this. Did you? Yeah. And she said, no. And we made this pact that we wanted to make sure that that somehow was highlighted in the book. But how? You know, one of the pitfalls of writing historical fiction is that you don't want it to read in a didactic way where you feel that you're being inundated with history. You want to be stepping into a world where you're walking in the footsteps of the characters, you're rooting for them, you're seeing their, you know, what they're seeing through their eyes. So the letter writing gave us a way to bring that history through Lily's lens and not have it feel, you know, oppressive and super saturated with facts. It comes in a different way. In the way of beautiful painting has brushstrokes where there's air around them that you can process those brushstrokes. That's what we wanted to do.
And I want to make sure that you guys don't walk away thinking that the learning was, cultural learning was going only one way. I mean, there were things we talked about I was ashamed that I didn't know, because I'd done a fair amount of reading in the Civil War. I did not know that there was a period of time where all of the Jewish soldiers were expelled from the Union Army, for being unpatriotic. I didn't know that. A term that I'm ashamed that I definitely have used, shoddy. I didn't know it was a slur that was created at that time because the Union Army believed that Jewish merchants were cheating the federal government. And I think there are these things, because the Civil War, we try to boil it down and maybe we teach it in 3 days or something, and we're scared to talk about it. It does become very reductive. And having two underrepresented voices in this time period for us was really important. And we really did not want to have a simple story. We wanted it to read like, you know, like you could keep on reading, and hopefully, even though we didn't whitewash history and there's some darkness, that there's light, but we knew that we had to show the complexity of the relationships between people during that time.
And I think one of the beautiful things that happened, and I don't think we could have anticipated, that because we were doing the research together and the writing together, that we would start to suggest things from each other's heritage. So there's a scene, you know, in Port Hudson again, where Shaunna said, you know, maybe the cottage should be, you know, set here. And I felt so touched that my friend is, you know, is suggesting the cottage in a scene. It was just like that we had merged, and, you know, as one when we were writing the book. And that's something that you couldn't have anticipated, certainly not, you know, when we began.
Are there other questions?
So I'm trying to visualize how do you actually go off or something. I just gave up a lot of conversation and the characters that interplay. How did that actually happen?
So, you know, it's everyone has asked this question because people do wonder. And I think, you know, people imagine, I think, that I wrote the Jewish characters and Shaunna wrote the Black characters. That's not what happened at all. From that moment we met in 2020 and decided we were going to try and write this book together, we wanted to write it in one seamless voice. We wanted you not to be able to tell who had written what. So what we decided we would do is that every Sunday night, we'd have a brainstorming session where we would discuss what was going to happen in the next chapter. And I would take very detailed notes. And then we created a Google Doc, which I never used a Google Doc. I feel like it's like an epiphany. Like, did you hear there's a smartphone? There's something called a Google Doc. The Google Doc is something that you can both work at the same time. And so I would take a first pass in very broad brushstrokes, sort of creating what we discussed as the scene. And then I would let Shaunna know that it was up there. And then she would go in, and almost like a wire armature where you have a sculptress putting like a thin layer of clay, she would then add more on her layer of clay. And then I would go and add another layer of clay until it was completely built to our satisfaction. Only when we felt that it was as perfect as it could be would we move on to the next chapter. So we slowly moved in that progressive way until we got to the end. And by the time we got to the end, even when we submitted it to the publisher, there was very, very few, I mean, one day's worth of work where we just sort of tidied up.
Because we were constantly refining. And, you know, at times if something was more rooted in someone else's heritage in the beginning, when we were first feeling it out, we would let that other person take a pass. And then Alyson said she refused to write anything about Black hair. Like she would like leave a bracket. She would like something about hair. And I'm like, oh.
But it was a very funny scene where we were describing the women who lived around the family of, you know, the other 3 women on Rampart Street. And Shaunna puts a note in the Google Doc like, does everyone have to, you know, look like a tall sunflower? Can we see some curves?
So it was funny. So, but that's the way we wrote. Because we were both researching at the same time, we had more Google Docs, and we would just put facts in our Google Doc, and then we could access them and say, let's bring this forward or let's push that back. It was, you know, this is my first novel, but Alyson has described it as being very different because you constantly have someone who you can brainstorm with and you can test an idea with. And there were times when we really did have to think about how we were going to describe things. We had, I don't want to say difficult conversations, but very honest conversations.
It was like a micro lens on language in a way that I wouldn't have done that by myself. I would have just written the story the way I imagined it. But there was a scene in the book where a small Black child is in possession of information that's essential to getting one character where she needs to go. And in my first pass, I described the character who receives this information as, you know, wonderfully surprised that this girl had shared this with her. And Shaunna wrote in the Google Doc, why is she surprised? And I at first was like, well, if she was white, she would have been surprised that she knew the information. But Shaunna made me really look at what language can mean into emboldening characters, into showing strength and intelligence, and that it was our responsibility to do that. And so looking at those small details constantly, I think has made me a better, more sensitive writer. Yes.
Any ideas for another book?
So we have fallen in love with these characters, and if you read the book, you know that it doesn't tie up in a nice, neat little bow. It actually ends before the end of the Civil War. And we wanted that purposefully because we weren't like, oh, the Civil War is done, it's all good. Like, we know that that is not the end of all of the issues that our country has to grapple with. So we can see following these characters into Reconstruction. We've already started thinking about it. We have a name for it called Indigo Dreamers. And then we would like to explore William and Stella's and Jacob and Lily's progeny as the music industry changes and as the country changes. So perhaps during the Harlem Renaissance, and then maybe into civil rights, where we know that Black and Jewish people forged a lot of bonds together. So
We're dreaming big.
yeah.
But as I told her in publishing, we have to get a really solid, foundation of readers before we can go on with that. But that's our vision. We hope it can. Thank you.
You're welcome. And you had a question too, didn't you? Please.
Not really a question, it's just so much from our little town in Lynchburg, Virginia. And my mom was a historian of sorts and collected everything and cut out and have all the magazines and what have you. And they wrote a little book because our town is built on 7 hills and so 10 hills. And my mother, before she passed away, told us to continue writing, continue the story.
Continue the story.
And I think that's my gift. I'm a validator. I tell everybody has a story. And you don't know. And when I look at you two sitting here right now, 2022, and you think about the Civil War, World War II, now, Jewish, Black, you think, how do we work together? Or we see each other differently, not with you two, but the whole. And it just makes me, I guess it encourages me, I get disappointed, I'm frustrated, but I'm encouraged to have those difficult conversations, I never meet strangers, you tell me about this. Yeah, it just pulls, what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
I mean, we kept on saying we wanted to bridge the divide.
Yes.
Increase the
To help
divide.
bridge the divide.
And that was the intention of this book. And
Totally.
to create.
I think you should continue the story.
Yeah.
There, to quote reminded me of this famous story. There's a children's story called Patricia Polacco. And she does a book based on her family that her hubby brought over from their own country. And it takes the quilt through many generations when they moved and where they lived. And what the quilt was used for. And the very last thing the quilt was used for was the huppah. No, it was not the huppah for the Jewish wedding, but it was used in the ceremony between the original bubbies, like great-great-granddaughter and the other Black man.
Oh.
Yeah, it was when I was reading to my class, by the time I would get to the end of the book, the tears were
Can you tell me the name of that book?
it's the quilt something, I
Okay.
cannot think of the exact name, but the author is Patricia Polacco.
Thank you.
It's got quilt in the title, I just don't remember the exact name.
Can you see a movie coming?
We would like that. Well, I will say that Alyson, one of Alyson's novels, The Lost Wife, is in development for a movie. So if that could happen again, we would love that. We would absolutely love that.
Yeah, so we hope, but the book is not even out 2 months yet. At the end of October, it'll be out 2 months. So the more people who start reading it and talking about it, it helps get the film producers interested.
I believe in you.
Oh.
Station. I think that the use of the lack of women's body autonomy for Stella is really poignant compared to how Willie's relationship with her husband is portrayed and how Fry is portrayed as his relationship with her, and then her love for William is very poignant because as women, especially today, we're getting our autonomy to our own bodies taken away. Back then, and even like during World War II for Jewish women in camps, we didn't have that autonomy over ourselves. So that's like a really, if you haven't read it and noticed it, it's a very poignant point.
There are a lot of scary parallels in the book to today's times, which is very, especially being a mother of a daughter, I find incredibly frightening.
Yeah,
Thank you.
There's a parallel of patience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Universal things that you.
Geishas. Yes. I'm just repeating for those who didn't hear, there's also a parallel with geishas, Japanese women who were basically
Virtual.
Yeah.
That they were auctioned off with the merchants, and I said, and then I didn't hold themselves. Was talking about a story of Muslim, a Muslim woman and Jewish woman, they were school teachers in New York, and how they were accepted or not accepted in the school and how they came together. And throughout that story or that movie, the arranged marriages, the covering of the hair, so many things that
Parallel.
that was just parallel. Yeah.
Well, I would like to believe that we all have much more in common than we do.
Absolutely.
You just have to see it, peel back the layers and see the soul within.
So,
Okay.
thank you so much. Thank you.
Just give everybody a little bit more information so you know about the book signing, and then also other things that are happening here at the museum and for Shaunna and Alyson. So we do have upcoming programs here at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. This Saturday, if you have young people in your life, like really young people, we're having a family program. It's a drop-in family program, and it's all about sewing and quilting. This is an ideal program for your kindergartner friends up to third graders, and it's free it's included with a museum admission, craft, and a snack. And you can continue exploring this idea of sewing and quilting with your family and little ones. So grandparents, take your Saturday, take your grandkids off your on Sunday, November 6th at 3, you can hear about current Southern Jewish research by oral historian and photographer Emily Williams. She's going to give us a glimpse into her ongoing work from this past summer where she spent traveling in Alabama. And that's at 3 p.m. on Sunday, November 6th. No, there is not a Saints game at that point. And it's never too early to start shopping for Hanukkah or the holidays. At the end of this, you'll exit through our museum store, and we encourage you to purchase whatever you'd like, including the thread collectors, which Alyson and Shaunna have graciously agreed to a book signing as well. So you can buy your book at our front desk and then go and get your book signed. There are also light refreshments. If you're like, I want to learn more about the thread collectors, like I certainly do, and you also want to go to Baton Rouge, this Saturday, these two lovely humans will be at the Louisiana Book Festival panel from 10:45 to 11:45, and an additional book signing from 12 to 12:45. So make your way out to Baton Rouge. And with that, I'm so happy to have you all here with us. Please grab a snack on your way out. There's also a little bit of bites downstairs. And
Thank you.